with our readings this morning in a very brief homily that will come after the video. We'll have the video now.
We have absolutely murdered our fields and our agriculture. We're sleepwalking into a huge agricultural issue with the soil quality around the world.
Our global population is expected to reach 10 billion people by 2050. We need to figure out how to supply enough food in a way that's sustainable for the planet. The answer may lie in vertical farming, stacking crops indoors and growing them with LED lights rather than planting them across fields. Vertical farming doesn't require us to take more land like rainforests or wetlands and convert them into farmland. But this isn't just to conserve land. It requires less water and creates less pollution.
Farming's actually one of the biggest CO2 producers.
There's a problem though. Vertical farms are expensive, currently 3 to 5 times pricier than traditional farms. The question is, can they ever be cheaper than farming the old-fashioned way?
We work on, can we grow something that's a price for all to eat? And then if we crack that, we roll the technology around the world.
This is Make It Count, a series on environmental innovations and the math it takes to bring them to the masses. This is James Lloyd Jones, the CEO and founder of Jones Food Company.
You can sort of see the size of the sites.
He runs the largest vertical farm in Europe. He has 26 tennis courts of growing space, 7.5 miles of LED lights, and grows fresh produce 365 days a year.
It was an overnight success story in 14 years of lessons learned up to this point.
When you take a farm indoors, you're giving up free access to one of your biggest inputs, light. Sunlight fuels traditional farming, and while its availability is seasonal, it's totally free. That's hard to beat. For vertical farming, lighting can account for up to 30% the operational cost.
The first thing that's got more people involved is the price of LEDs, because LEDs were hugely expensive, so people didn't want to build big farms because of a high capex cost.
But as LED prices and efficiency continue to improve, vertical farming is getting more appealing from a cost perspective. Vertical farms also compete with free sunshine by using light recipes, unique combinations of spectrum intensity and duration.
It doesn't mimic sunlight because sunlight has a lot of light that they don't actually need. They're optimized specifically for our basil. It just happens to be pink.
Plants benefit disproportionately from different wavelengths of light. Vertical farms use their electricity to generate only the specific wavelengths that are best for the plants. Saving space and water, automating repetitive tasks, and reducing the supply chain also help cut the cost of operation.
We're cutting down the supply chain from lots of people handling crop over many countries, many borders to get to your plate.
New technologies also play an important role, not only in sustainability, but in developing an overall system that can compete with traditional farming. Currently at Jones Food Company, solar panels installed on the roof supply around 10% of the site's total electricity requirements annually.
It's got solar panels on top that give power to auxiliary systems, and it's being plugged into a large-scale solar site across the road, so the whole site will constantly be powered by the sun with battery backup. That's good for business. With rainwater, capture your rainwater, and you capture your large-scale humidity out of the main grow room, then you save buying water. So it's good for business again. Economics of vertical farming is still a challenge. Everything comes down to price. We're working in a commoditized market. We're trying to get the most yield out of the most space, sell it for the fairest price, and make our technology work and pay for itself. But for the economics to work, the technology needs to still come lower than it is now.
What will it take for vertical farming to compete on price with traditional farming, something known as price parity?
My first site I built is 55,000 square feet of growing space. We're now seeing that we have to scale up with the number of farms.
Currently, it costs around $10 million to build a vertical farm. But what happens when you expand the number of farms?
With scale, you get economies of scale. So you get your per square meter of growing space cheaper. You're able to get closer to the goal of price parity.
But when it comes to competing with imported food, that price parity is right around the corner.
We're already selling product into 2 major retailers, the same price that it would be imported. So we're already there on that.
Although vertical farming is getting closer to competing with traditional farming, it may still be hard to adopt due to consumer hesitancy.
It's not natural argument. It's quite hard to get over. If it's not grown in soil, they don't recognize it as organic. But large-scale greenhouses have been commercially providing peppers, cucumbers, and tomatoes hydroponically many years. It's very natural and it's better for you.
There's a level of education that is going to need to be done to overcome the skepticism of eating plants that are grown in buildings.
But when people taste the product, they have a more fulfilling punch of flavor, a higher nutritional value, and a longer shelf life.
Cost of land, electricity, water, and robotics all play a big factor in slowing the proliferation of vertical farming.
We don't sit and just build the technology and think, hey, we're amazing, this is working. No, that should be reiterated. How can we make it cheaper to build? How can we make it cheaper to operate? How can we make it better 10 times over?
These challenges can be overcome with time, and soon enough, we should be able to sustainably grow food at an affordable cost in any environment.
So thanks to Mary Ellen for finding that really interesting look at vertical farming, the hope that perhaps we could grow the food we need to feed the world in any environment in a way that might actually be sustainable and affordable. One of the things that jumped out at me, though, in that video is that there's 2 main challenges that were identified. The one is just the cost, and that has a lot to do with technology and a lot to do with when these things are adopted at scale. But the second main challenge is actually getting people to accept this as an alternative way of growing food. That's actually kind of a funny thing to stop and think about for a minute. Because as consumers, it's really easy for us to think, oh, I like the way that I'm accustomed to buying my food at the farmer's market or in the grocery store, and I like that this is organic, or I like that this is grass-fed, or I like the way that I do things because I'm settled in my routine, and it works for me. Becky is in Calgary this week, so I've been on my own with the kids. And I've said to myself over and over again, oh, this isn't how it's supposed to work. I like my routine. This works for me. And all of that's been shot this week, as you might imagine. But it's a really natural thing to say, no, I'd prefer the status quo, even if there's something else that is better for me and better for the world. Just give me what I'm used to. It's way easier. You may have noticed that in our gospel reading this morning from Matthew, Jesus seems to be in a bad mood or something, right? So Jesus is asked this question about his authority. Why is he doing this? On what basis does he get to do these things? And he seems to be really evasive. He doesn't seem to want to answer the question that's asked. And then when he does say something at a bit more length, he tells this strange story and seems to disparage the tax collectors and the prostitutes as if he's holding them up as people that we can look down on. What on earth are we to do with this strange story? The first thing to know is that this is happening essentially on Palm Sunday. So if that's helpful, you got to situate yourself in that season of the church year. Jesus has entered Jerusalem to shouts of Hosanna, and with this lingering, hovering sense that something bad is about to happen. And when he gets into town, one of the first things he does is he goes to the temple and he overturns all the tables where there are money changers. People that are profiting from the rules of the temple, people that are participating in a system that benefits those who are in power, the religious elite. And Jesus goes into the temple and says, this is not how it is supposed to be. And he's angry. And he overturns tables and kicks people out and makes an enormous scene that is really embarrassing for the Pharisees. And that's threatening to the Pharisees because he's challenging the way things are. So the Pharisees come to Jesus and say, by what authority do you do these things? Except that they're not really asking, on what basis is this happening? Tell us more. What they're really saying is, just who the, choose your own expletive, do you think you are? They're really saying, what on earth do you think you're about? Do you not know who we are? And so Jesus says to them, Sure, we can have that conversation. But if we're going to have that conversation, let's do it on a level playing field. Why don't you tell me what you really think is going on here? Just be honest with me. And so he asks, is John's baptism a divine thing, or is this all nonsense? At least take a position on that so we can have the discussion. But this puts the Pharisees in a bind, because if they say that what John was up to in his ministry was inspired by God, then they kind of need to get on board with what John is saying. But they don't want to do that because that challenges the status quo. They also don't want to reject it outright, because if they do that, they risk angering everybody, because John is popular. He's got a big following. People recognize John as a prophet. So they're stuck. They don't want to take a position, because any position they take challenges the status quo. So they say, we don't know. And Jesus says, yeah, that's what I thought. We can't have the conversation unless you're willing to have the conversation. And then Jesus says, there's this father who asks two sons to go and work in the vineyard, and one says no, but then does it, and the other says yes, but then doesn't. And they agree that it's actually the one who ends up doing it that's doing the right thing at the end of the day, not the one who's saying the right words and going through the motions. And so what Jesus really is saying is, you folks in power, you people who benefit from this system, who think they can decide who's in and who's out and how all of this is going to work, by your own standards, you think these people, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the people that Jesus is fond of hanging out with at dinner, so much so that he gets accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. Jesus says, these are my people. They're way ahead of you in terms of righteousness, and you don't even know it. He's not disparaging them. He's saying, you Pharisees, you comfortable, settled people at the top of the pecking order, you need to see the hypocrisy. You need to see what is going on, because God is up to something new. And the problem is, it's disruptive. It is easy in the season of creation to get a sense of fatigue. Oh my goodness, are we talking about this again? It's a heavy topic, and it's often hard to know what to do with it. It's easy to feel a sense of despair. Or when we observe days like the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, Orange Shirt Day, it's easy to get a sense of fatigue. This is a challenging topic. Maybe you've been told a different story for most of your life, like I was, about what it meant to be a Canadian, what it meant for people to settle this country. And maybe the narrative that is emerging is threatening or strange. Maybe it disrupts things that you'd prefer to just leave unexamined. I get that. But we're called to do more. We're called to be open to disruption. Did you catch the question at the end of the reading from the book of Exodus this morning? It's a great story. I always love these stories because there's a whole series of them where the Israelites are traveling through the wilderness, and in spite of themselves, they just can't help but complain from time to time. It's a little bit like an extended camping trip. You might be having fun, you might know it's the right thing, but there are still those moments where it's like, why did we even do this? And so they're grumbling again. Why, you brought us out of Egypt to just die in the wilderness of thirst? Even though they've seen amazing things, even though they know God is with them, they can't help but from time to time go, this is really hard. We don't want to carry this weight around. And so Moses strikes the rock, and there is miraculously water in the middle of a barren place. And he names the place after the question that the people are asking. Is God among us or not? That's a question that is actually at the heart of our wonderings as a people all through the ages. Is God really with us or not? And goodness knows there's plenty of reasons to look around this world and think, really? Maybe not. But the ultimate answer to that question actually comes to us in the incarnation, in the person of Jesus, God among us, who shows us what God's love looks like when it's made flesh and walks in our midst, who shows us that our humanity and all the things we get wrong isn't a barrier between us and God. But here's the thing. When you ask and try to answer that question, is God among us or not, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is, the answer is yes. God is among us. Jesus is among us. The bad news is, the disruptive news is, the challenging news is, that Jesus is working his way into the temples of our hearts and overturning tables, inviting us to wonder which things we might need to let go of, telling us that we need to hold that status quo really lightly because God has different plans for us and the world. So that might have implications for how we talk about climate crisis. That might have implications for how we hold the ongoing conversation about reconciliation with First Nations people. That might have implications for change that's on the horizon in your life. Maybe there's something you think you're supposed to do, something you feel called to, but it's big and scary and takes you to a place that makes you feel vulnerable. Maybe there's a way that you need to adjust. Maybe things have changed in your life, for good or bad, and there's an adjustment that's really difficult, and it's tempting to just ignore it. Jesus walks into those situations and overturns the temples of our complacency and invites us to be open to disruption, because it's in the disruption that we see what God is doing in our midst, and we're made alive to be part of the next thing. So my friends, today, this week, may you see Jesus in the midst of the places that are comfortable and settled, where there is power, overturning tables, upending traditions, challenging the status quo. And may you be inspired to ask yourself, what is it that God is disrupting in your life? Amen.